Be taking communion together, so if you did not get one of these, when it's going time for do that, just I'll make sure that you get one, all right? So make sure you have one of those. Great. All right, we're on a journey through the book of Hebrews. And just as a little reminder, the writer of Hebrews was writing to a group of believers who are in the midst of intense persecution. That's an understatement. And families were being separated. People were being murdered in the Colosseum. And Nero was having a heyday trying to get rid of what was known as followers of the way, or the Nazarenes. They had a lot of different names for them that went around the city, and so that's what they were doing. And yet, they were having an impact in that whole city on where they were. They were starting to have an impact in that whole part of the world. And people were standing up and taking notice. There were people that nobody else wanted to have anything to do with, and yet here are these crazy Christ followers that are going in and they're actually interacting with these people, inviting them in their homes, and actually trying to love on them in order for them to lean in towards God. And so these Christ followers that were in the midst of this persecution, they were being trying to be convinced by this other group who were Jewish in order to convince them to go back to Judaism and to kind of leave their faith and to go back to following Jewish laws back then, because what that would do, that would help them to not be so persecuted anymore. And so they were being tempted to go back to what they were doing before. And so the writer of Hebrews was like, I need to write these guys a letter to remind them of some things, some truths that are extremely important, because the themes throughout the book of Hebrews is faith and hope and endurance. And I don't know, any time in our history right now, we need faith and hope and endurance. Right now, with everything that's going on. You know what? This is a political year. I hate political years. Cannot stand them. I don't like what goes on. I don't like all the, oh my gosh, it just drives me nuts. Right? And people there's so much fear that is just drenching people's souls on this and taking them to get their eyes off of the one who can actually give them faith and hope and endurance. So we're working our way through this, all right? Those of you that are on Facebook Live, welcome. We love our Facebook Live family. We're going to be doing communion at some point, so if you want to get out some bread and juice or milk or I don't care what you use. But just know that we are going to be going there at some point, all right? Okay, so usually I'd like to give you the one thing that I want you to get above anything else today. It's the one thing. I always put it in your program jacket there. Here's the one thing for today before we jump into that, and it's this. Jesus is the perfect person. Jesus is the perfect person to represent us, to plead my case to God with love and mercy. Jesus is the perfect person to plead your case to God with love and mercy. And so where we're going to jump into today gives us a reason for that, okay? Because we're going to talk about this whole concept of, because see, the Jews back then, they were used to a priesthood. Now, now look. I grew up in a denomination where we had priests, okay? There were priests in our denomination, right? Right? But back then, their priest wasn't like the kind of priest that I, interacted with, like when I was growing up. It was a whole different kind of system that was in place. And the most important of the priests was called the high priest. He was the main dude. All right? And so the writer of Hebrews is going to give us this picture of a high priest, and then he's going to compare it to Jesus. He's going to compare it to who Jesus was. All right? So I also printed off a card that's in your program jacket that has all the verses on it. If you want to follow that way, you can do that, but they'll also be on the screen. So I'm just going to read for you Hebrews chapter 5, verses 1 through 10. All right? Here we go. Starting in verse 1. Every high priest is a man chosen to represent other people in their dealings with God. He presents their gifts to God and offers sacrifices for their sins. And he is able to deal gently with ignorant and wayward people because he himself is subject to the same weaknesses. That is why he must offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as theirs. And no one can become a high priest simply because he wants such an honor. He must be called by God for this work, just as Aaron was. We'll get to find out who this Aaron guy is. That is why, verse 5, that is why Christ did not honor himself by assuming he could become high priest. Nope. He was chosen by God, who said to him, "You are my son. Today I have become your father." And in another passage, God said to him, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." Okay, we're going to look just a little bit on who this Melchizedek guy is. Okay, verse 7. While Jesus was here on earth, he offered prayers and pleadings with a loud cry and tears to the one who could rescue him from death. And God heard his prayers because of his deep reverence for God. Even though Jesus was God's son, he learned obedience from the things he suffered. In this way, God qualified him as a perfect high priest, and he became the source of eternal salvation for all those who obey him, and God designated him to be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. There's that name again. All right, so we're just going to, let's look at the first 4 verses just for a second, okay, in this. Because he gives some qualifications of a high priest, okay? This is what their job was, okay? This is what they were supposed to do. Okay, they were supposed to work on behalf of the people. That was their job, okay? That's what they were supposed to do. They were supposed to help other people. That was their job, okay? That's why they're here, okay? Number 2, he was responsible for offering sacrifices for sins, including his own, okay? Now, this whole concept of offering a sacrifice for sins, that just sounds like a weird concept to us. Like, we're like, what the heck? What is that? Offer sacrifices for sin. We're going to get into that, okay? All right? Another thing is that he was called by God among sinful, weak people. Okay, so he was around people that were not perfect at all, but he was called to pastor them. I'll use that word because we're more familiar. He was called to pastor them. Okay, but in the first 4 verses, we get some insight onto who this high priest guy is. Okay, verse 1 tells us that he was just an ordinary man among all the other people. He was not super spiritual. It was not like he had this amazing walk with God. I mean, he was just an ordinary person, okay, like everybody else, okay? And then when we get to verse 2, is that he struggled with the same weaknesses that they did. It wasn't like he didn't struggle. He struggled just like they did, which was common with everybody else. He had those same struggles as a high priest. Okay, verse 3, when you look at verse 3, it says that he was also sinful, just like the people he was representing. Okay, he wasn't a sinless person. He was sinful just like they were. Okay? Which is why he had to offer a sacrifice for his own sins. Okay? And then in verse 4, any honor that was given to him came right from God alone. Like any honor that would be bestowed on him would have to come from God alone. All right? That's who they were. So in other words, this idea of high priest was as a mediator or an advocate for the people. Okay? To the people of Israel, between them and God. That was his job. All right? He was kind of a go-between. The only problem was that the high priest was flawed. The earthly high priest, he was flawed, and just like anybody else, any other human being, and there was no real honor given to him except if God gave him honor. Okay? Okay? In fact, in that passage, the writer of Hebrews uses this guy named Aaron. This guy named Aaron. Aaron was Moses' brother. Okay? And so Aaron painted this picture on how this imperfect person, this flawed person, can be called by God. He was the first high priest ever. That was Aaron. Okay? And Aaron was Moses' brother. He spoke for Moses many times. You know, we know that story as far as the Israelites and being able to escape Egypt. And so Aaron was God's mouthpiece many times as he was talking, right, to Pharaoh. He helped Moses lead more than 2 million people out of Egypt. Okay? That was Aaron. But he was also sinful and gave in the temptation from other people. Okay? While Moses was up in Mount Sinai, right? He was waiting to get the 10 commandments from God. Aaron was down with the people, and he gave in to the pressures of the people, right? And he made them a golden calf to worship. That was Aaron. He did that. He did that. But God still chose Aaron to become the first high priest for the nation of Israel. So the writer of Hebrews is setting this up, going, you need to understand, the earthly high priest, he was flawed. He wasn't a perfect person. By the grace of God, he was able to minister to other people. Okay? And I'm going to give you kind of a picture on the high priest. Okay, I'm going to show you this next picture up here. Take a look at this. Okay, let's go to this next picture up there. Okay, you need to understand, like, they would dress up in this garb, okay, that meant a lot of the stuff what they wore meant something. Okay, there's a lot of religious stuff in this, like his turban thing. That was to make an atonement. That represented an atonement for pride. And then this breastplate that he's wearing, every one of those jewels represents the 12 tribes of Israel. And so that was an atonement for errors in judgment, right? And then he wore this multicolored sash thing or whatever. That was an atonement for a sinful heart. See, these all represented something that he wore. The blue robe, an atonement for evil speech. Golden plate was worn on his head. holy to the Lord. This was something that was on there as an atonement for arrogant attitudes. Multicolor ephod, atonement for idolatry. Fine white linen tunic, atonement for killing. Inner white breeches. I think that's underwear, but I'm not sure. Is an atonement for sexual transgressions. Okay? Everything he wore meant something. Okay? That's who they were, right? Right? And so here's the thing. They had this grand title of high priest. They had a bunch of these holy responsibilities to perform, but at the end of the day, they were still just as flawed and human as you and me. At the end of the day. Okay? In fact, listen to how one theologian put it this way. The fact is, such an imperfect priesthood was never meant to be permanent. God never intended for there to continually be a priest offering up continual sacrifices in an ongoing imperfect system. All along, God planned to one day pronounce, "It is finished," and establish a permanent priesthood with a perfect priest. Okay? So now we're going to get to verse 5 of Hebrews 5:5. Listen to this. He says, "That is why Christ did not honor himself by assuming he could become high priest. No, he was chosen by God, who said to him, 'You are my son.'" Now, the original language, that literally means, "I have revealed the fact that you are my son." Okay? And then in another passage, God said, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." So now the writer of Hebrews is comparing Jesus to this this system of high priest, right? Because of what the high priest would do. Okay, so now he's bringing Jesus into the picture. Okay, so he says this guy named Melchizedek. Who in the world is Melchizedek? Melchizedek was a king and a priest of what's pronounced Shalom. That was the name of the city. It's pronounced Shalom. He was a king and a priest. And his name means King of Righteousness. That's what Melchizedek means. Okay? King of Righteousness. And so when the writer of Hebrews says that Jesus is of the order of Melchizedek, he's literally saying to be of the order means to be of the same rank. He's of the same character. He's following in his footsteps. Okay? Of this guy named Melchizedek. Okay? Okay, listen to this in Genesis. Okay? This is when we first hear about Melchizedek. Listen to this. Genesis 14, starting in verse 18. "And Melchizedek, the king of," it's pronounced Shalom, but he's saying, I'll say it. "And a priest of God Most High brought Abram some bread and wine. Melchizedek blessed Abram with this blessing. Blessed be Abraham by the God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has defeated your enemies for you." Then Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of all the goods he had recovered. Okay, so the first time we read about Melchizedek, what is he doing? What is Melchizedek doing? He's bringing Abram bread and wine. Bread and wine to celebrate his victories over his enemies. Now, we're going to be doing communion soon. Okay? We're going to be doing communion. What are the two elements that we use during communion? Bread and wine. Okay? Bread and wine. What are we celebrating? What are we celebrating when we take the bread and wine. We're celebrating a victory, not the kind of victory that was going on here, but we're celebrating the victory that Jesus had over sin and death. That's what we're celebrating. That's why he's being compared to the order of Melchizedek. Okay? It was happening a long time ago. So, Melchizedek was both an earthly king and priest, right? We're going to learn more about him even more in chapter 7. There are some crazy things about Melchizedek that makes you step back and you go, ooh, that's a little weird. All right, but we'll get there in chapter 7. All right, but here's the difference. Melchizedek, Aaron, all of these other high priests that were there, they were flawed. They were sinful. Okay? Jesus is our eternal king and priest. Jesus, he wasn't limited by those bounds. That wasn't Jesus. Jesus was different. Okay? Verse 7 of Hebrews chapter 5. Listen to this. While Jesus was here on earth, he offered prayers and pleadings with a loud cry and tears to the one who could rescue him from death, and God heard his prayers because of his deep reverence for God. Even though Jesus was God's son, he learned obedience from the things he suffered. Okay, so in these two verses right here, we're looking at Jesus. He's describing Jesus as an authentic human being. Probably the most authentic human being to ever walk the earth. Besides Adam and Eve, before they entered into sin, Jesus is probably the most authentic human being that had ever walked the earth. Because he didn't have that sin issue in his life. He didn't sin. So he was authentic in how a human being should be around other people. And how a human being should interact with God. And how a human being should live their life in order to please God. That was Jesus. Okay? That was Jesus. Okay, this is okay, so, and then the other thing is this, okay, Jesus wasn't like, do you ever see any of those Jesus movies where Jesus is like this, like his eyes are like he looks like this robotic like guy that is I don't know, this weird look in his eyes or whatever. Like I'm old, so I've seen a lot of Jesus movies, okay? And Jesus wasn't some robotic type person, right? That was immune to emotional weaknesses. No. No, in fact, it says that he was tempted in all things, yet without sin. Okay, just like we are. All right? And then it says this. Even though Jesus was God's son, he learned obedience from the things he suffered. Okay, I want you to think about that for a second. This is a huge spiritual truth right here. Huge spiritual truth. He had to learn to obey God by going through hard things. Just like we do. Just take a little survey. Anybody here gone through hard times? Anybody at all? Yeah. And it's like Jesus, authentic human being, had to learn through going through hard things. It's just like when we listen to our parents and learn from what they teach us, okay? I remember, my mom, of course, I'm a very inquisitive kid, and I was always taking things apart and always looking at how things worked, and just a very inquisitive kid. And I remember that my mom told me, don't stick anything in the light socket. And of course, my first question is, why? Well, because it's not good. You'll get a shock, and And in the back of my mind, I'm going, a shock? What is that? So, you know what I did, right? Yeah. Right? I'm like, oh, okay. I'm not going to do that again. Right? I mean, think about, okay, now that as a kid, how many times do we do that as an adult? Right? We know that if we go there again, we know, because we've been there before, if we go there again, we're going to get burnt. Right? And the reason why we know we're going to get burnt is because we've been burnt. So we learn. Right? We learn. And so we're learning this truth about Jesus is that he was authentically human just like we did. And guess what? He learned how to obey God the same way we can learn how to obey God. Okay? Because he's like us. Sometimes we grow and learn the most when things are tough. Sometimes we learn and grow the most when things are tough. Right? When you become desperate for God, it's like you get some clarity for him to move, right? All right, verse 9, here we go. In this way, God qualified him as a perfect high priest, and he became the source of eternal salvation for all those who obey him. And God designated him to be a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. There he is again. Okay? Bottom line with earthly high priests, they were temporary, imperfect mediators between God and people. But Jesus is different. He's the perfect high priest. Perfect and eternal. And he's here for you. He's here for you. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 5. For there is only one God, one mediator who can reconcile God and humanity, the man Jesus Christ. Imagine if you had to, if you could fellowship with God only by traveling hundreds of miles, okay, to a particular place at a certain time of year through a specific order of religious rituals. Imagine that's how you would reach God, right? Through a specific order of... Do you know that some people actually view their pastor or priest like that? Like, I can only approach God if I go to you, because you're the professional. And I can only approach God if I do these certain rituals a certain way. Then I can approach God. Right? That's how we think. But listen to this. Our high priest, Jesus, our high priest and king, is everywhere present. He never takes a day off. And he's always ready to listen to your prayers. Always. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So the writer of Hebrews is wanting us to understand that this whole thing that started way back before Jesus was part of his plan in order for us to connect with the fact Jesus is the perfect person to plead your case between you and God. He's perfect to do that. And he says he does it with groanings that are too deep for words. Every day. For you. For you. All right? All right, so everybody get out their little communion thing. Those of you on Facebook, gather your stuff together. Okay, so this whole idea of this sacrifice thing, where the high priest would go behind the Holy of Holies curtain thing, and he would actually sprinkle the blood of an unblemished lamb on the mercy seat. Okay, this thing that was constructed that represented the nation of Israel. And he would actually sprinkle the blood from this lamb on it to cover it. And the reason why he was covering what that was representing was he was covering for the sins of Israel. Can you, I'm like this sometimes. I'm like, wow, how much blood would it take to cover my sins for a year? Like, whoa, that's crazy to think about, right? But here's the thing. That system was not meant to last forever, and it was flawed. Because they might have had their sins covered, but their sins were not forgiven. It wasn't until Jesus came on the scene. And when Jesus came on the scene, he said he was able to, because he was the sinless, spotless Lamb of God, right? Who could take away our sins. It says in Romans that he broke the power of sin in our life. Sin always causes death. And so when he broke that power, he said, now guess what? Now you can actually have everlasting life. Not everlasting death, everlasting life. And so when Jesus, that night that he was betrayed and he was with his disciples, when they were sitting down to dinner, it says that he took some bread. This has two parts. Open up the transparent part to get your little wafer thing. And it says that he took bread and he broke it into pieces, passed it around to his disciples, and he said, this bread represents the fact that my body is going to be broken for you. In fact, my body is going to be ripped to shreds for you. And because he's going back to what was taking place at the very beginning with the bread and the wine, with Melchizedek. He's going back to the very beginning, and he goes, I want you to celebrate this victory by remembering what I did on the cross for you. Let's take this together. And then he took the cup, filled it with wine, and he said, this cup represents my blood. In fact, this represents a brand new promise between God and you. This is a new promise. Because before, what the high priest had to do every single year without fail, every single year, you had to have him do that. And not only did he have to do that every year, but there were all these other sacrifices that had to be done. Every time you screwed up, you had to go to a high priest, and then he had to do something else again. And every time you screwed up and you told him, you had to go do it again. And so Jesus is saying, look, you need to understand, this brand new promise Okay? This new promise that's going to take place, this is a one and done. And when you sit down for a meal and you break out the wine, I want you to stop and I want you to remember that I shed my blood not to cover your sin, but to forgive your sin forever. Because he is the ultimate high priest. He said, every time you do that, remember what I did. Let's take this together. Those of you that are on Facebook Live, thank you so much for joining us today. We love our Facebook Live family. We will see you next week, the rest of us. This song that we're going to sing, is this validation of what Jesus did for us on the cross. A validation on what it did for us. All right? So let's stand.